Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to Ask Dr. Jill with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and our friends at the Mighty. Um, First of all, let me just introduce you all to my friend, Dr. Jill Harkavy-Friedman, who is
Hi,
our
everyone.
VP of Research.
Hi, everyone. How are you today? Hope you're all having a decent day and tootling along.
Tootling. I
I
like
know,
that word. I think we should all try and tootle more often.
definitely. We can tootle our own horns.
Oh my goodness. This is going to be a good one. This
No,
episode,
I'm just
I can
really
tell
happy
right
to
off the
be with
bat.
everyone today and to uh, have a chat together.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this. It's been a little while. I'm Brett Ween. I'm the Director of Writing and Entertainment Outreach for AFSP, and I am going to be Jill's sidekick and pepper her with questions. There'll be peppering, there'll be tootling. Um, I want to tell you a little bit before we get started about what month it is. We're at the tail end of September, which is National Suicide Prevention Month. And our theme for this year's campaign was about AFSP's Out of the Darkness walks, which take place in communities all across the country affiliated with our local chapters. Um, and our campaign tagline for September was Together, Let's Walk. It's all about connection and being together and looking out for each other. And the great thing about the Out of the Darkness walks is that they raise awareness and they bring people together, and they also raise funds which enable us to provide grants to develop innovative and practical research. We're the largest private funder of suicide prevention research, and today's episode, to go along with all of this, is to do sort of a top 10 list of the top 10 things we've learned as a field about suicide prevention from the scientific research. And who better to talk us through those top 10 things than Jill as we get your questions, some of which we've gotten in advance. And if you'd like to type in a question, we would love to hear it, and we'll get to as many as we can. Jill, I want to ask you about the research in terms of survivors of suicide loss, people who've lost loved ones to suicide, and how it relates to connection and sharing your story, because I think you mentioned something interesting about that.
Yeah, so we're learning little by little about research related to survivors of suicide loss, and we're actually trying to build that researcher community because we feel we need more research in that area to understand the impact of losing one to suicide and the healing that comes with it. And so, some of the research has shown that two factors that help people to experience what's called post traumatic growth after a suicide loss include talking about the person and connecting with others. That not talking about the person and not connecting actually can limit a person as they're healing. But we also funded a study that has to do with treatment for something now called prolonged grief. It used to be called complicated grief. The idea coming from if you have a condition like a surgery and something doesn't go the way the natural course should be, then it's called a complication. So the idea of prolonged grief is there's no timeline on grief. However, there is a pattern of healing where eventually people get back into life. And it's not that you forget about the person you lost, but you're able to kind of carry them along on your journey. But sometimes people get stuck that they yearn for the person so much that and long for them being there that they're not able to connect back to life. And actually, it turns out that complicated or prolonged grief treatment, which involves talking about what happened, there are many steps to it. It involves the physiological or the physical response to grief and loss and trauma. Like when your gut tightens or you gasp and you hold your breath. Those are physical reactions. And then also the emotional reactions and connecting those and then expressing them and connecting even with the person that you lost in a different way. So we're learning a lot about grief after suicide loss. Oh, and by the way, we've also studied what happens in people's brains when they are experiencing a loss. I think this is the cool thing that you were referring to. You know, a lot of times when people are healing, they think, well, if I'm not thinking about the person, then I must be forgetting them. But it turns out brain research that measures your brain function and when you're thinking about different things has shown that even when you're not thinking about the person you lost, your brain is still processing the loss. You're not forgetting that person. You're not letting go of them. You're processing and healing, even when you're not thinking about it. And so, therefore, it's important to connect to life as part of the healing process and not worry that you're ignoring the person or you're canceling them out. You're still processing it, you're still healing. And then, with what I said before, talking about it, sharing it, and connecting with others, that healing process helps you to, you're not going to forget the person, you're not going to get over it. You lost that person, it's a huge pain, but you'll find a place in your life for that loss so that you can also engage in life and have and maybe even engage in suicide prevention.
Wow, there's so much that you said there, Jill, that rings so true for me. You know, as a suicide loss survivor myself, that in terms of talking about it and sharing the experience, I think we often think of people who are struggling with their mental health as feeling alone, and isolation is, you know, one of the risks for suicide. But also for people who've lost someone or people who are actively caring for someone who's at risk.
You
Um,
know, I'll tell you something about the walks and loss. So I know somebody who had a friend, who still has the friend, for many, many years. And it turned out that friend had never revealed for 20 years of friendship that she had lost her son to suicide. And one day she was walking in the park and she saw a sign for the AFSP Out of the Darkness Walk. I swear this is a true story. I'm not making this up. And she went to the walk and it changed her because she was no longer hiding her loss. And she also knew that she was not alone. And that was many, many years ago. And she has gone to the walks ever since and come to a new place of understanding and living with her loss just by seeing the walk and attending. So they're very powerful.
yeah, and I think, you know, another thing to say about the walks before we jump into the top 10 list and questions is that I think people who haven't been to one, they worry that they're going to be like very, very solemn and depressing, or, you know, who knows what their anxieties are about it, which I totally understand. But you see everything there. There's a whole range of emotions, which also includes laughing and a lot of positivity, and people turning their loss into raising awareness and doing something, and just being in a sea of other people who get it and
Yeah,
understand
and
and have some
connecting.
connection.
Yeah, and laughing, they're actually fun. I mean, they are, you know, they touch at your heart and your loss. Or if you're experiencing, you know, some distress or suicidal ideation, you know, it touches that at the same time in a way that what we're talking about with connection. So, and they're really fun, and you just know when you're there, you're not alone. Even if you don't talk to anybody, you know you're not alone.
Yeah. So we encourage you to check out the Out of the Darkness
Well,
walks if
I've
you're
been to
watching.
them ever since they started in 2004, well before I became on staff for AFSP. As a researcher, our team used to go.
That's great. Yeah, people put together teams. It's just a great experience, and I can't say enough about it. Um, so, without further ado, shall we get into our top 10 list?
Yeah, I just want to say a couple of things. First of all, in case you don't know, October is Rocktober, and that means we'll be sharing research all of October in videos, in blog posts, in little infographics with some cool information and new information. So please, you know, stay tuned, and whatever we have, you're welcome to share. The second thing is that what we're talking about may sound very basic, but the truth is that we didn't know any of this before around 1975. So this, like I said, this is going to sound basic to you, but everything we're going to talk about came from research that happened after 1975, and research builds on itself. So that's all I'm going to say as a preview.
That is a good point. I think some of it is going to seem really basic, and some of it might be, I think some of it might be surprising to people,
Oh yeah.
but we'll see.
Mm-hmm.
And people will write in with their questions and comments. One person has already commented. They just quoted you back to you, Jill. The transformative and connective nature of the walks are powerful. Or maybe that was their comment. It's in quotes here to the side.
Not sure, but it sounds good.
I like it. Like some, yeah.
I think it's true.
Approved. That comment is approved. Well, what better way to step into Research Plus October, Rocktober, than by rocking out with our top 10 list?
Let's do it.
And so, number one of the things we know based on research about suicide and suicide prevention, suicide is related to brain functions that affect decision-making and behavioral control, making it difficult for people to find positive solutions.
So first of all, it's a lot to unpack. But let me start by saying, as recently as 1974, the brain was not discussed as contributing anything to suicide. Suicide was considered, you were misguided, you were a sinner, you were a lost person. But the idea that it was actually a health condition and the body and brain function was related to it was not a consideration. And so it's only recently and through a variety of studies looking at the brains of people who died by suicide and comparing them to people who died of other causes, doing brain imaging studies to look at how brain function works, doing neuropsychological studies where we look at the relationship between brain and behavior. So through all those methods, we've learned that the brain changes, the brains are different in structure and function from people who are not engaging in suicidal behavior or dying by suicide. And again, I want to say that we're talking about suicidal behavior. There is suicidal ideation, which way more people have than people who make attempts and then people who die. These are actually, it's not a continuum. These are actually distinct groups that overlap. So some people who think about it end up making a suicide attempt. Some people who make an attempt end up dying by suicide. But the truth is about 95% of people who make an attempt will not die by suicide and will go on. So when we're talking about this, we're talking about right now actual behavior. So I don't want people to think, oh, I thought about it and therefore I'm at risk. It doesn't work that. It's not a one-to-one. So the idea is that, and the second thing is that our brains are very plastic and they change. I'm going to say more about that. But so we found that people who are at risk for suicide, we just funded a study that, this is fascinating, showed they did neuropsychological tests to see brain behavior in young kids, general adults, and the elderly. And all these people had depression. And what they found was that there were certain neuropsychological differences having to do with having less flexibility in thinking and having to do with how people make decisions and how are they looking at longer term rewards, like down the road, or are they more focused on short-term rewards, like right now? And they found differences, but the amazing thing is they found that those differences were the same across all age groups. That's really different from what they found, for instance, for depression, where that depression actually looks different in young people and general adults and the elderly. And we're finding that a lot in research, that there is an underlying biology of suicide, and it's more consistent across the lifespan and across genetics than in other like mental health conditions or other disorders. So to go back, what they found and what other people have found is that decision-making is affected because people are not able to see all the options. So they make misattributions. They think that something's never going to go away because they are stuck in the short term and they're not able to think more broadly. And when people are in a suicidal crisis, they don't have access to their usual coping. So that's why sometimes we think, oh, but they were so great, they did everything, they were so successful. But in that moment, they can't shift their focus from how much pain they're feeling and how much they would just want to stop the pain.
I want to ask a question that someone wrote in that I think involves this, and maybe it'll help if you can explain in just a really simple way. Someone wrote in, how do researchers know what those who died by suicide were thinking or feeling?
That's a good question. And the truth is, we don't know what they were thinking or feeling at that time or right before. That's a big difficulty in doing this work. But we have several ways of getting a window into that. So one is to talk to the friends and family of people who die by suicide. And we do what's called a psychological autopsy. Now, sometimes they're very structured and we ask very specific questions, but there's also always a part to say, tell me about that person. What were they like in the past couple of weeks? And when had you seen them last? And what did you talk about? And so they try to reconstruct what was going on. But at the same time, risk and warning signs are not just in the moment, they're over days and years. And so we also want to know, we also ask about, did they ever have head injury? Did anybody in their family ever have a mental health condition? Did anybody else ever die by suicide? Do they have a chronic health condition? Are they in terrible pain? So we ask a variety of questions, and we look at medical records to get a sense of what was going on for that person. And we can't ever know exactly what was going on, but we know. We also study people who've made suicide attempts and try to use that as an indicator. It's not the total solution, because I just told you most people who make attempts don't die, but it gives us a little bit of a window into what they may have been thinking. But we do know some of the things that by asking, we learn about things they were experiencing. And then, of course, people leave diaries. They sometimes, but rarely, leave a letter. They may have social media posts. And so all that information is gathered. And people tell different people different things. So by getting information from a number of sources, we try to piece together as best we can what was going on for the person. We also do follow-up studies, but those take a lifetime, because fortunately not that many people in a particular study will die by suicide. So I wish they would just tell us and then we could say, okay, let's work on that together. That's kind of our goal, but we can't know exactly.
Jill, you mentioned a couple of entirely different things that we happen to have gotten questions about. So I want to get to those two questions
Great.
Separately. One of them, it's so specific, but you mentioned head injury. What is the current research on the relationship between suicide and concussions?
So there's there's mild traumatic brain injury, which is maybe not even getting knocked unconscious. There's people who get knocked unconscious once or twice, or have a concussion. You don't have to be unconscious to have a concussion. And then there are people who are knocked unconscious. So I have actually worked on some of these studies that have shown that the rate of head injury in people who either die by suicide or make suicide attempts is higher than the rate in people who don't. Okay. It's not that people who don't engage in suicidal behavior don't have head injury. And this is the whole complexity of suicide. Whatever we say is related to suicide, a lot of people have it. But it's the multitude, the many different things layering on top of each other, the presence of head injury with, let's say, mental health conditions, with chronic physical conditions, with early trauma, that could increase a person's risk. It doesn't mean that they're going to actually act on it. It just means that in the face of stress, they might be at greater risk. So with head trauma, we know that head trauma can do a few things that might relate to suicide. One is that it can disinhibit a person so that their brakes are not on, where they might normally be able to refrain, to not do something when they have a thought about it. depending on the head trauma, they might be more likely to act on their thoughts. So they become what we call disinhibited. The second is that their personality might change, and their way of thinking and decision making, like I said before, might get constricted so that they're not able to access everything. And often there's depression that goes along with head injury. And a lot of times with suicide, the depression, those factors plus substance use ends up playing a role. So again, most people with head trauma are not going to die by suicide, but the rate of head trauma in people who make attempts and who die by suicide is about, in the studies we did, it was about 40%, which is pretty high.
And we're going to, further down on the countdown, one of the things on the list has to do with risk factors and how there are multiple risk factors. So we'll get into that, spoiler alert, further. And by the way, that I haven't done like a Casey Kasem impression while doing this countdown so far is pretty amazing. That I've
feel free to when it comes upon you.
All right, we'll let it happen organically.
Okay.
The other question that you touched upon, what research is there about leaving notes? And specifically, this person asks, do men typically leave a note? That's an interesting.
That is interesting. I don't know about gender differences in who leaves notes. Plus, it's very hard to study, although with psychological autopsy you can, because sometimes they don't appear till somewhere down the road. But the estimate is about 17% of people who die by suicide leave a note. And the reality is it's never an answer. There's this wish that if someone leaves a note, you're going to understand the reason they took their lives. But because of the way the brain is functioning, as if there's nothing else they could do, it's not going to answer that question. Sometimes they provide some insight to what somebody was feeling. Other times they can be very surprising and not very nice. So it would be great if somebody could just write you a note and say, this is what's happening and the reason that I'm doing this. But there isn't one reason, and their thinking is not their usual self. So that's 17% of people from the latest study that I've seen. So most people don't leave a note.
That's interesting. I feel like that speaks to something about how the person is thinking, that it's not, that their thinking is affected, and it might be, even if they've been thinking about it for a long time, they might not completely be as organized isn't the right word, but just to think in that moment, to think clearly, to leave a note or something. Because I think often in TV and movies, that's used as a dramatic device, right, with someone who dies by suicide leaving a note. But the reality that it's only like 17% is interesting.
And it doesn't really most typically doesn't explain. And that's, by the way, that's, like I mentioned, that's another window into what's going on for them if they happen to. But many deaths by suicide happen very quickly between, even in somebody who's thinking about it for a long time, the time between thinking about it and actually taking that decision to act can be very, very quick, 10 minutes, half hour, so people aren't really, even when they're planning it, they're not necessarily going to write a note.
And the next thing on our countdown, I think, has something to do with that. And I'll also mention, I don't know if we've linked below to the top 10 list, but that might be something that we do and people can have a gander in case it inspires any questions. But number 2 on the countdown, this is interesting. Limiting a person's access to methods of killing themselves dramatically decreases suicide rates in communities.
Yes, and for a person in the moment too. So, but it is a public health intervention that can lower a community's rate. So,
can I just say one thing?
Sure.
Before you go on, as I rudely interrupt you, but I think this alludes to, I think a lot of people have this assumption.
That's what I was going to say.
That if someone doesn't have access to their preferred method, their access to means to die by suicide, won't they just find another way?
Right.
And so this alludes to that, and I'll let you speak on this
Right.
now.
So this is, thank you for the setup, and we think alike. So yeah, people think, oh well, they'll just do something else. But first of all, something else may not be accessible. Second of all, if there is something else accessible, then it's likely not to be lethal because you've removed the lethal means. But third of all, remember I said about the brain functioning being limited? So if they go for something and it's not there, sometimes they don't really have the capacity or wherewithal to shift gears. So this is sort of the good point about having limited cognitive ability. They don't really have the capacity to shift gears and think of alternatives. So if it's not there, more likely you're putting time in, and time will usually de-escalate a crisis and also allows for somebody to intervene. So there are many factors in there. If you limit access to lethal means, they're not going to shift gears. And there's lots of studies that show, even if there's another same method available, next door, they're not going to shift to that. It actually lowers the population rate of suicide if we're talking about some public things. But they're also not going to shift gears. But you have time to de-escalate the crisis, for them to think, oh no, maybe I don't want to do this, because suicide is inherently, typically, an ambivalent act. There's a wish to die and a wish to stay alive. And so sometimes time just helps to de-escalate the crisis, and it also leaves time for people to come and intervene.
Someone had written in, and this is in a way the ultimate question, but I want to see how you apply it to this particular point. Someone wrote in just very simply, how can I help prevent suicide? So thinking in terms of this.
Question. So let's start, if you have lethal means, now we can't, let's be honest, we can't lock everything up. We have to live. But if you have lethal means that are easy to access, or that you're worried about someone in your space, whether they live there, or it's a friend that's coming to visit, or the child of your child's friend that's coming to visit, and you're worried about them, the best is to remove access to lethal means from your home. If you can't do that, then lock it up and make it inaccessible, so that in that moment somebody can't grab it and use it. Because people don't have these things because they're thinking someone's going to use it to kill themselves. They have it for a variety of reasons. They want it, they use it, but when someone's in that state and it's lethal, they might use it to kill themselves. So usually people aren't thinking in the way, oh, I have to do this to protect people. But actually you do have to do it to protect people. So one thing you can do is, I'm purposely not saying different kinds of means, because that's safe reporting. So I'm not going to list off all the ways you can kill yourself and what you could do with it. But you could go to our website, and if you go to Project 2025, for instance, you could learn some things. The second thing you could do is do what you're doing now, which is learn about suicide and be an active support in the lives of the people that are around you. So learn about what to look for when you see it. Normally we're very forgiving. Oh, they have a bad day, they're having a bad month. Oh, this school year sucks, next year will be better. And we don't necessarily see the changes that are happening in a person. So if you see changes, even if your natural instinct is say, it'll be better tomorrow, that's a non-suicidal person's view. It'll be better tomorrow, right? Hopeful, and things are going to change. But in a suicidal person's view, things are never going to get better and they're hopeless. So if you find yourself explaining away something that you're seeing, take a moment and then check in with that person. Just trust your gut. You don't have to go right to, are you thinking of killing yourself? You can start with, I noticed that you've been up all night, every night for the past 3 nights. What's going on? Can I help? Maybe we should go see a doctor. And by the way, when people stay up a lot, sometimes they think about killing themselves. Are you thinking about that? So that's the second thing. Learn what to do. And if you are concerned about someone, just check in with them. The way suicide works, you're not going to make them suicidal or at risk. They're either at risk or they're not in a particular moment. So, but asking them can actually be relieving, that they're not carrying this burden. You can help them just by listening. Like you can't convince them. You don't want to put them in a position of having to convince you why they're right, life isn't worth living, right? You want to listen and let them talk that through so they come to the position that, oh, maybe I'm just not thinking as I usually do. And maybe there is something I could do. So check in with them. So those are two things. The third thing I want to say, besides walk, of course, is is to advocate for laws that help people with access to mental health care and suicide prevention information. And you can become an advocate with AFSP by going to afsp.org/advocate. It's the coolest thing. And if we don't bombard you with emails, but if there's legislation coming up, like 988, that's how we got 988, because we all sent in emails and letters. So you just put your information, your address, and your name. And if there's legislation coming up at the state or federal level, we'll send you an email that's prepared. And there's a little paragraph space for you to fill in if you want to say something personal, which of course I always do because I always have something to say. And then you push send. That's the whole deal. And we had hundreds and hundreds of people saying we need an emergency crisis number that's easier than 1-800-273-8255. And we need a crisis service to go with it. That came from advocacy.
Like, we got a really specific question that I think goes along with what we're talking about. Someone wrote in, what to do when someone tells you how they want to kill themselves, their exact plan, and tell you that they are so hopeless, but also on the other hand, they won't take any help. That's heartbreaking as a girlfriend who doesn't live in the same country as he does at the moment.
Yes, it is heartbreaking. And it's heartbreaking on many levels. And I wish I could say you could just talk him out of it. And you may or may not be able to do something. You can only try. Ultimately, it's up to that person in their thinking as they are. But I'm going to bring out my 4 words because I think they're relevant, which is have compassion for him. Know that there is hope and there are reasons, but that he can't access that right now. Respect his ability to come to, eventually, hopefully, the idea that life is worth living. Be patient and be persistent and be present. But know that ultimately that person, it's really up to them. You can't force someone to get help. On the other hand, if you're not there, but there are other people around him, and I don't want to give advice about one person in one situation, but I always think about activate supports. So you don't have to be the only person if you're worried about somebody. Activate supports. If they have a therapist, even if the therapist won't talk to you, you can talk to the therapist and leave a message on their machine telling them what you see. They can listen even if they can't break a confidence. Second of all, if there are other family or friends around, help contact them to support the person. But ultimately, you can't guarantee that someone's not going to take their life. But you just try the best you can, and be persistent and patient, and have compassion and respect, both for yourself and for the other person.
Thank you for answering that, Jill. I think that is probably very helpful for people. I also want to pick up the pace a little bit with the top 10 list, or else we're going to leave people without knowing all 10 things.
Okay.
These are such great questions. Number 3, 90% of people who die by suicide have an underlying and potentially treatable mental health condition. And we've gotten one question that I think goes along with this, but I want to ask the big devil's advocate question with this one to me is, so is someone who has thoughts of suicide or made attempts or died by suicide mentally ill?
Is someone? Okay, so let me rephrase that. Okay, so most people who take their lives are not mentally well. Let me start with that, because we are meant to live and be productive. And so, whether it's a DSM diagnosis, which is really just a description, But there are lots of people who have mental health conditions who don't take their lives. So the idea is that it's something that may be, in a sense, necessary, but not sufficient. In other words, you're like 90% of people have been found to have them. You may have heard, what, it's only 50%? But that, I wrote a blog on this. You're welcome to look it up. But and there's a new papers that are coming out, but there are methodological issues as to why the numbers vary. But the bottom line is, from over 30 something studies internationally across age groups, this has been found. And again, like everything else, lots of people have mental health conditions. They don't even think about taking their life, let alone take it. So it's not causal in that way, but it's something that's treatable. And now this is the really funky thing. Treating the mental health condition is important for suicide prevention, but it doesn't necessarily remove the risk for suicide. And so, for instance, in research, you find that people who have major depression and have made suicide attempts in an episode have also made attempts outside that episode, because it's not one and the same. It's an underlying risk factor that comes from many different variables. So I would say that it's a necessary condition, but it doesn't explain suicide. And there are lots of people who have mental health conditions who don't take their lives. And again, as I mentioned, you're going to find this with everything that contributes to suicide, because there's no single thing that leads to suicide.
You're giving away number 6, which we think, yeah, I mean, the way I think of it is, and tell me if I'm wrong, we all have mental health just as we all have physical health. So someone who is having a suicidal crisis, their mental health isn't great at that moment.
Right. And, like I said, some people in the suicide prevention field are saying that it's not about mental health. That's a different statement. It's not just about, I would say it's not just about mental health. It's about all their risk factors and how they come together in a point in time in the context of stress. And the stress may precipitate suicide. But you also have to think about how you deal with the stress and how somebody else deals with stress, and whether or not you all deal with stress the same way. I would say no. I look at my sisters and myself, and I know we deal with stress differently. And there's not one reason that we deal with it differently, but something could stress me out that doesn't faze them at all, and something could stress them out that doesn't faze me at all. So having it just be stress doesn't really work. Just like we're in a pandemic with multiple stressors on top of it, and thankfully most of us are not even thinking about taking our lives. It's the person who is vulnerable for a variety of reasons, including mental health, but not only mental health, that when stress occurs, remember I told you they can feel hopeless, like there's no solution, and they don't have access to their usual coping. And so it's the stress for a person who's at risk can be a catalyst for suicide. But the stress in and of itself is not.
One person writes in, there's a problem with a mental health condition that's treatable and whether that person has access to treatment.
Absolutely. And we know that access to care is a problem. And it's specifically a problem for underrepresented groups and groups that live in more distant areas where they don't have, I went to our Alaska chapter, and, the police are 200 miles away. I shudder to think where the hospital is, and so how are they going to have access to mental health care? And so we have to find alternative ways to help people. I naively thought, oh, that's okay. We'll do telehealth, and then we'll give them express, mail them their prescriptions if they need it. But guess what? It doesn't work that way either, because they don't have great internet. And sometimes the post office is just a little hut where they put the stuff outside and it's gone before the morning. So we have to think about ways and local ways to help people who don't have access to care. And then there's a systematic racism, I'm just going to call it what it is, that limits access to different groups of people based on their things like ethnicity, race, gender identity, sexual orientation, where care is either not being provided or it's actually being denied.
That's great. I want to move on to the next one. We're at number 4 out of 10.
Oh, and I thought you said 6, but okay, let's go.
No. I was saying we're gonna deal with a certain aspect of what we've been talking about in number 6. So Brett's anxiety today is brought to you by whether we'll get to all 10. We'll
if
get
we
to
don't, you can find them on the website.
This is true.
We'll be expanding on them in other conversations.
If we haven't gotten to all of them, because I want to make sure we're taking questions,
yes.
we can share them with you at the end.
Exactly.
Number 4, but now back to the countdown. Number 4, depression, bipolar disorder, and substance use are strongly linked to suicidal thinking and behavior.
Well, I think we've pretty much addressed the role of mental health conditions in suicide. Those are when people die by suicide, those and schizophrenia and psychotic disorders are the most strongly linked to suicide. And there are other disorders that co-occur. So we say that are comorbid. So you may have heard about eating disorders or PTSD. These are very unpleasant, uncomfortable, treatable mental health conditions that are often accompanied by either depression, bipolar disorder, psychosis, or substance use. And when they're combined, that can increase the risk. But when you break it down, and we funded some research, for instance, on eating disorders, and they showed that depending on the type of eating disorder, the associated additional mental health conditions may differ. But it still comes down to there's a higher incidence of substance use, psychosis, and depression, and bipolar disorder. So they may co-occur. They are treatable, but they're not always easy to treat. And that's where you need to be patient and persistent and have compassion and respect that it's going to happen, and just finding someone who will work with you on that.
Yeah. One person wrote in, how can we be more sensitive to signs when someone hides their struggles?
You know, there are definitely people who hide their struggles. They're the people who are so popular and happy all the time and doing 5 different things, and they were the best at everything. You still need to check in with them. You still need to make sure they're taking time to fill their resilience reservoir. You still need to make sure that they're not so busy trying to do all those things that they're not taking care of themselves. So with any friend, we ought to do, check-ins regularly. They may or may not tell you. People can be very good at hiding it. Letting them know that you're okay to hear it, and you're not going to judge them, and you're not going to avoid them, and you're not going to try and convince them out of it. Those things, talking about your own wellness, mental wellness, all those things can help encourage someone to see that you don't have to worry about being stigmatized. And the other thing is, we have to tell people, just because you're thinking about suicide does not mean that you're going to end up in the hospital. It means we need to have a conversation so together we can figure out what's the best plan of action. And really, unless you're like imminently in the moment at risk, we have interventions to help you through those moments and to help families help their loved ones through the moments. But I would assume that everybody's got problems and issues, and just, have conversations and check in. And that sets a tone that we ought to be talking about our mental health.
And Jill, you mentioned treatments, which leads us into number 5 on our list. Specific treatments used by mental health professionals, such as cognitive behavior therapy, SP, and dialectical behavior therapy, which, by the way, was mentioned. I don't know if you watched She-Hulk, but episode 1 talks about DBT several times, in fact. It's wonderful. The Hulk uses it. Anyway, I don't want to give away She-Hulk.
Well, I'll have to get into it.
It's a fun show. And also, let's see if I can remember the acronym for CAMS. Collaborative Assessment of Management of Suicidality?
Close. And management of suicide. Yeah, what all these treatments do is they They add, remember I said that just because you treat the underlying mental health condition doesn't mean that you've, treated the suicide risk. These treatments all provide some tools for people to manage their suicidal ideation so it doesn't turn into behavior. So there are different views of literally inspecting the scenarios that lead you to down the path towards suicide. And then each one is different in how they deal with that, but they give you tools depending to help you manage that. So like I said, it doesn't translate into behavior. And that's the additional component. Now, it doesn't always work like anything else. You could take, blood pressure medicine and it still may not help your blood pressure, but it does help, and it gives people tools. There's other things like learning how to solve the problems that you're not sure how to solve, so you do impulsive things. That's another. But these treatments, and you can go to the treatment section on our website to learn more, and there are links to each of these treatments. But what we've learned is, to me, it's kind of funny that the treatments and the studies of the brain have gone in parallel. We've learned that people get stuck and they don't know how to problem solve and think outside the box. And we've also learned almost independently that we have to give people specific tools for managing the suicidal ideation and behavior because they have trouble thinking out of the box. That's the link between the two.
That is great. So without further ado, we've mentioned number 6, which I think is a really powerful and interesting one. No one takes their life for a single reason. Life stresses combined with known risk factors, such as childhood trauma, substance use, or even chronic physical pain, can contribute to someone taking their life. So, Jill, can you talk about this a little bit? I think people often, when someone takes their life, the rest of us automatically want to say, like, well, it must have been because his wife left him or he lost his job or something like that. It's very natural to try and find a single reason. So tell us about this bit of research.
Yeah. So by the way, we don't know all the potential contributors, and we know that people have multiple contributors and not just one. But I was thinking just now that, you know how some people, whenever they're stressed, they get a cold, right? And other people don't. How does that happen? Because one person's system has a lot of factors: inflammation, ability to fight infection, all these things. They just, when they get stressed, they get a cold. And then another person doesn't have that. Their system is more resilient, let's say. They don't get a cold. It's like that with suicide. So it's not the stressor. I think I said this before. We all have stresses. Most of us have broken up a relationship. Many of us have had financial difficulties. People have all kinds of horrible stresses and they don't take their life. But they're not going to take it because of one reason. They have a vulnerability because of a variety of factors that I've mentioned to being at greater risk to go to suicide as a place when they are stressed. And so very cool. I'll give you an example. Some of the genes that have been found to be related to suicide are the stress genes. And they have to do with how sensitive someone is to stress and how reactive they are to stress. So, I mean, you know how we each have a temperament, and like some people get stressed out at the simplest thing, and then other people, like, they never get stressed. Well, some of that has to do with your genes. Obviously, some has to do with the environment, and some has to do with your history. But it's like, if you have those genes that make you more reactive to stress, and you don't have the problem-solving skills, and you're in terrible pain, you may be more likely when stress comes along to engage in suicidal behavior than a person who doesn't have those risk factors. But again, you can have those risk factors and actually never engage in suicidal behavior. So it's really how things come together in the moment, and that thinking that it's never going to change, feeling desperate and hopeless.
So we've got a question that I want to get to, and it's related to number 7 on our top 10 countdown. One person wrote in, what's the best way to check in on a friend's mental health? Which is a great basic question. And number 7 on our list of findings has something to do with that, which is, and I think this is a really important thing for people to take note of. We know from research that asking someone directly if they're thinking about suicide won't put the idea in their head. Most will be relieved that someone starts a conversation with them.
Exactly. So I think at this point, I'm hoping you get the idea that suicide is complex. And even though we don't know what leads someone in the moment to take action, we know that you have to have those risk factors. You have to be vulnerable. And so you even if someone responds with suicidal thoughts, it's because of what they're carrying around. It's not because of what you said. You can't just create that at the spur of the moment by saying something. Like I said, if somebody's at risk, you could possibly, potentially, not you, but that's why we try not to talk about methods and how people killed themselves and stuff like that. So, but if you just ask them, are you thinking of killing yourself? That's not going to make somebody suicidal. And in fact, they may be carrying that around, and in their mind, they're a burden and nobody cares. Now, they may use that logic and not tell you because in their mind, they're a burden and they don't want to burden you with it. But that's the problem with that is that comes from the brain dysfunction, right? They are not able to see that you could love them and want to help them. Even, let's say they are a burden, but they don't get that you wouldn't, just because they're a burden doesn't mean you want them dead and gone.
I mean, you could say the same thing about someone with a physical condition.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you're worried about a parent who has cancer or heart disease or something, in some ways that's a burden on your life. You're worried about them, but it doesn't mean that they are a burden.
Right.
Does that, I don't know, that's how I would put
it's
it.
like, so I think about is how, and I say this often, so you might have heard me say this before, how somebody can think, I love my family and my family loves me, but I'm a burden and they'll be better off without me. Like, that's not sensical, but that's how they feel. And so we have to start from how they feel, not from what we know. So when someone says they feel like a burden, it's okay to say, yeah, it's, I'm taking you to the doctor, but I want to do that because I believe you can feel better. I also joke that when I broke my foot, I was definitely a burden to my husband, and he's driving me crazy, constantly catching my elbow to make sure I don't fall. And it's because he doesn't want me to be a burden to him. But I don't think he wanted me dead. I'm pretty sure about that, just because I was a burden. But that's the idea. I think it's okay to say, yeah, it's not easy, but I care about you and I'll do whatever I have to do to help you.
Yeah. And it's, people.
Yeah.
Oh, go on.
No, I was just going to say, being true and honest is part of the picture, which also includes, I feel for you because you're experiencing things that seem hard.
All right, we're about to enter the lightning round on this countdown. It's 4:53. We've got 3 left. Number 8, certain medications used to treat depression or stabilized mood have been proven to help people reduce suicidal thoughts and behavior. Yes.
Believe it or not, one of the most effective medicines for reducing suicide risk over the years. And there's lots of research. I just want to say there's a lot of people who like medicine doesn't help, ignore medicine. I don't know what their beef is, but maybe they don't take medicine for anything. Sometimes they're just against mental health medicines, but they can be very helpful if they're indicated. And one of the most helpful medications turns out to be lithium. You don't hear a lot about it because it's 29 cents a pill. It's not a big. Also, we give it differently. No, I don't give it because I don't prescribe. But we used to, when I started out, they'd overload you with lithium till you got toxic, and then they'd bring it back to get you in a therapeutic level. They don't do that anymore because there are potential toxic side effects. So they give much smaller doses and monitor your levels. Another medication for people with psychosis is clozapine has been shown to reduce suicide risk. ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, has been found to reduce risk. There's some suggestions about some new things that may, but we don't have the data out, like transmagnetic stimulation, TMS. We're funding studies on that. You probably heard about ketamine. We're funding studies on that. The thing about ketamine is it doesn't, even if it helps, it doesn't last. So we're funding studies to say, well, what can we do to bring this to the long term? So, but medication is not a panacea. Everybody responds to it differently. And sometimes, like anything else, it's trial and error. If you've ever had an infection and amoxicillin didn't work, so you took erythromycin, medicine is an art because every person is different. So the trick is to find someone who's willing to work with you to find the medication that helps you. But the other part is taking the medication will help you to learn how to solve your problems. It's not going to solve your problems. So it's usually the combination of therapy and medication for people who need medicine that is most helpful.
Got it. So one person wrote in, what are the right things to say to someone who is in crisis? And I'll pair that with number 9 on our list, which is if someone can get through the intense and short moment of active suicidal crisis, chances are they will not die by suicide. So can you explain that a little bit?
Sure. If there was a right thing to say, we would all be saying it and there wouldn't be any crises. So I think the thing to think about is to try not to be judgmental, try to listen. It's not about what you say. They'll ask you, if they want something from you. But you listen instead of putting them in the position of having to tell you why they should die or why things will never change. That's what happens when you get judgmental or give answers. But people may want help and they may say, I don't know what to do. So what have you tried? Do you want me to make suggestions? It's a simple thing like that. But it's okay to say, I feel like you're in such pain. I'm here for you. And honestly, I don't know what to say to you, but I'm not going away. And if I can't be with you, let's think of who else can be with you to help you through this time. You don't have to have the right answer. You may just sit and watch TV. And that sometimes that is enough for someone who feels like nobody would ever want to be in the room with them. So if you say something and it upsets the person, it's okay to say, I don't really know what to say, and I'm sorry if I upset you, but tell me how I can help you, or let's just be together, but I want you to stay alive and I care about you and I'll do. And sometimes it's also helping them. If you come to their house and it's a complete wreck and they have no food in the refrigerator and they haven't groomed in a month, you could just help them by bringing food, sweeping the floor, putting their junk away and getting them in the shower. Not all at the same time. That's a big overload for somebody who feels like that, but little by little. So it's about being present, about being clear that you don't have an answer and you might say something's wrong, but hopefully something will come out that'll be helpful.
Just being there with someone in the midst of these moments that they're feeling so terrible. It's not about solving the problems or
Right.
doing anything like that. It's literally just about being with them
and getting them to help. And sometimes the best thing you can do is make the calls for them to find a therapist, or call 988 and ask them what you could do to help, or put them on the phone. 988 is there for all of us, not for people who are in crisis, but also for people who care about people in crisis.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because I think a lot of people don't realize that. And you can call up and explain the situation and get advice if you're worried about someone.
Mm-hmm. What are we on, 10?
We're on 10, believe it or not. And it's a very hopeful thing. And I want to pair it with a very hard-hitting question that I thought would be good to round things out so you can respond to it. So number 10 on our list of the big things we've learned from suicide prevention research. Most people who survive a suicide attempt, 85 to 95%, go on to engage in life. And the question that I want to throw your way, Jill, is someone wrote in, do you think that suicide is not preventable in some cases, like a cancer that grows undetected?
I think that we don't know how to prevent every suicide right now. I wouldn't, I would be foolish to think that we knew that now. Just like we don't know how to prevent cancer, but we know how to treat cancer, right? And we can help people through the cancer more often than not. It used to be never, right? When I was a kid, you never said the C word. Women just like disappeared, right? And it turns out that they had like breast cancer or ovarian cancer, but you never knew it. And so then we had to learn how to say the word cancer. Then we had to fund research to find out how to cure cancer. And now there are many cancers that are almost 100% curable, but not all. And so I think we're at the point of being able to say suicide, having some treatments, but we're not yet at the point of having cures. And I don't like the word cures because we're not going to cure life. Life has stress. Life has, we experience horrible things, mildly horrible things, pandemics, racism, stress, flood. Look, we've had floods and fires and bugs and, I'm not saying everything is wonderful, but I do hope that someday we can help most people stay alive, and more than stay alive, find a way to get joy out of life and to have connection and want to stay alive and engage and maybe want to prevent suicide, and help us with that.
That's so, I love the way you put all of that, Jill. And it's, people, sometimes when we say suicide can be prevented, I think the way that hits some people, especially if they've lost someone, they think, oh, well, should I have been able to prevent losing my loved one? It's not that. It's you do the best you know with what you know at the time.
So let me just, in the olden days, we started with suicide is preventable because nobody thought it could be prevented. So we're like, suicide is preventable. Suicide is preventable. Okay, so now we have people saying, okay, you can prevent it sometimes, but not always. So then we had suicide can be prevented, but we're not there. So, but we can't prevent all heart disease. We can't prevent all cancer. We can't prevent all diabetes. We can try to manage it the best we can and try to help people have the best lives they can have. And we can do better than we are because we have a lot to learn through research.
Yeah. And someone wrote in, and we've officially gone into overtime now, which is always very exciting. One person asked, and this will be for maybe a future Ask Dr. Jill, what's the new research being worked on now? So, and someone else had written in, where do you get your ideas for topics? And so I would like to throw down the gauntlet and say, comment if there's a specific topic you'd like us to talk about on a future episode. Please write it in because we want to respond to what you're interested in.
Yeah, definitely. And I appreciate everybody being here and the conversation, because this is part of suicide prevention, is all of us not just talking, but asking questions and listening. Like as a researcher, my life is one question after another. And it's not answers. I don't know all the answers. Research hasn't given us all the answers. It's a process of inquiry so that we can learn. And we must never forget that we're talking about people here with, full lives and connected to other people and facing all kinds of difficult things. But we are meant to be productive and to progress, and we can help each other do that when we're not thriving on our own.
Well, thank you, Jill. These conversations, I really treasure them, and I treasure you as a colleague and as a friend, I don't mind saying. And I think
I feel likewise. We can have a love fest, but I also so appreciate people showing up and asking questions.
Yeah, I've been glancing at the comments in general as we've been going on. I haven't been able to see every single one of them, but it's such a great conversation. So I want to thank everyone who participated in that. We can link to the risk factors and warning signs below if people are interested in more. I'll also say if people are interested in more about research, before I let you go, you can check out afsp.org/research. You can also check out our last annual report where you're going to find all the blurbs about the different grants that
in science we call them abstracts, but in writing we call them blurbs. And on our website as well. And also we have tons of videos and infographics that you can share, but be on the lookout during Rocktober because we're showcasing some new ways to share information. And if you get involved with the chapters, you may be teaching people in your community about suicide prevention.
Well, I just want to thank you again, Jill, and thank everyone for tuning in as we round out September National Suicide Prevention Awareness Month, and we get right into Research October, Rocktober, where we're going to keep rocking out with all the suicide prevention research, and we're going to keep asking questions and learning more so that we can help save lives and make a difference. And we thank the mighty and every one of you for tuning in. Thanks, Jill.
Thank you so much. So happy to be here.